Some men carry their pride like a weapon, never knowing it can be turned against them. A younger fighter shoves an older man on a London sidewalk outside a private martial arts event. The crowd freezes. He throws a fast kickboxing combination. Clean, sharp, designed to embarrass. He lands nothing. The older man catches his wrist mid-strike, twists it at a sharp angle, and sweeps his legs from under him. He hits the cold pavement. That younger fighter is Jason Statham. The man standing calmly over him is Steven Seagal. Statham tries to rise but feels his elbow locked where 1 inch of pressure means a career-ending break. Seagal leans down and whispers something that changes everything. What did Steven Seagal say that left Jason Statham sitting alone on that cold London street, gripping his wrist, staring into the dark? If this story hooks you, follow for the full truth. Now, to understand how 2 of Hollywood's toughest men ended up on a Soho sidewalk that night, you need to understand what was happening in both their lives at that exact moment. Because this wasn't random. Not even close. It was the autumn of 2005. Jason Statham was on top of the world. The transporter had turned him into an action star almost overnight. The sequel made him a franchise. And here's the thing about Statham. He wasn't just an actor playing tough. The man had been a competitive diver for England. He trained in kickboxing, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and mixed martial arts for years before Hollywood even noticed him. He did his own stunts. Every single one. No wires. No doubles. He was proud of that, and he made sure everybody knew it. So when interviewers asked him about other action stars, Statham had opinions. Strong ones. He respected some. Jet Li. He trained with Jet Li and walked away humbled. He said so publicly. But there was one name that always made him shake his head. Steven Seagal. Now get this. In at least 3 recorded interviews between 2003 and 2005, Statham went after Seagal directly. He called Aikido choreography with a GI. He said Seagal hadn't thrown a real punch since the 80s. He said the man used camera angles to hide the fact that he could barely move anymore. And he said it all with a grin, like it was obvious, like everyone in the industry already agreed with him. And honestly, a lot of people did. By 2005, Steven Seagal's career had taken a steep fall. His last few films had gone straight to DVD. The press had moved on. The studios had moved on. He was no longer the man who starred in Under Siege. He was the man people made jokes about at parties. Overweight, out of touch, a relic. But here's what Statham didn't know, and what most people in Hollywood didn't know either. Seagal had never stopped training. Not for a single day. While the cameras stopped rolling, the man was on the mat every morning by 5. Kido, Judo, Kendo. He had a 7th-degree black belt in Aikido. Not honorary. Earned. He had been the first foreigner to ever operate a dojo in Japan. He had trained with masters whose names most martial artists only read about in books. And unlike the flashy, cinematic version of Aikido that people saw in his movies, the real art, the one Seagal practiced behind closed doors, was designed for one purpose only: to break bones, dislocate joints, and end a confrontation in seconds. Statham had no idea. So when the invitation came for a private martial arts exhibition in Soho that October, both men were on the guest list. It was one of those invite-only events. No press, no cameras, just fighters, trainers, stunt coordinators, and a handful of producers who liked to watch real technique up close. The kind of gathering where reputations were made quietly. Statham arrived with his training partner and a small entourage. He was relaxed, confident. He'd just wrapped filming on Crank, and his body was in peak condition. He walked through the venue shaking hands, talking technique, laughing loud. He owned the room. Seagal arrived alone. He came in through a side entrance. Black coat, black shirt, no entourage. He spoke to a few old contacts, watched some of the demonstrations, and then stepped outside for air. He stood on the sidewalk, calm, hands in his pockets, watching the Soho traffic drift by. That's when Statham saw him. Now here's where the story turns. Because what happened next wasn't planned. It wasn't staged. It was the kind of moment that happens when ego meets opportunity and no one is there to pull the brake. Statham spotted Seagal through the window. He turned to his training partner and said something. His partner laughed. Then Statham put down his drink, rolled his shoulders, and walked toward the exit. Someone near the door heard him say 4 words. "Watch this. It's time." He pushed through the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The London air was cold. The street was half empty, and Steven Seagal was standing 15 feet away with his back turned. Statham didn't hesitate. He walked straight up and shoved Seagal from behind. Hard. The older man stumbled forward 1 step, then turned around slowly. His face showed nothing. No surprise, no anger, just a kind of calm recognition, like he had been expecting this for a very long time. A few people near the entrance stopped, then a few more. Within 30 seconds, a small crowd had gathered on the pavement. And that's when Jason Statham made the worst decision of his career. He didn't walk away. He didn't talk. He raised his hands, set his stance, and threw the first combination. It was fast. Believe me, Statham could throw hands. A jab to test distance. A cross aimed at the chin. Then a low kick designed to buckle the knee. 3 strikes in under 2 seconds. Textbook. The kind of combination that would drop most men on a sidewalk. Seagal didn't block a single one. He didn't need to. He moved. Not fast in the way Statham moved. Not explosive. He shifted his weight like a door swinging on a hinge. The jab passed his face by less than an inch. The cross cut through empty air where his head had been a half-second before. And the low kick. Seagal simply wasn't there anymore. He had drifted to Statham's outside angle like smoke. Now here's the thing. Statham was a trained fighter. He knew when a combination missed, you reset. You don't chase. You pull back, find your range, and go again. But he didn't get the chance. Because the moment his kicking leg came back down, Seagal was already inside his guard. The older man caught Statham's right wrist. Not grabbed. Caught. There's a difference. A grab uses strength. A catch uses timing. And what Seagal did next was pure Aikido. The real kind. The kind that doesn't exist in movies. He redirected Statham's own momentum against him. Twisted the wrist at a sharp, precise angle. And the pain that went through Statham's arm was unlike anything he had ever felt in a ring. He described it later to a close friend as a lightning bolt that started at his fingers and exploded at his shoulder. His entire right side locked up. His knees buckled. And before he could process any of it, Seagal swept his legs clean out from under him. Statham hit the pavement hard. Back first. The impact pushed the air out of his lungs. The crowd gasped. A few people stepped back. One woman covered her mouth. And Seagal was still standing in exactly the same spot. He hadn't lunged. He hadn't charged. He hadn't even raised his voice. He had simply redirected a younger, faster man into the ground using nothing but angles and pressure. Now get this. The whole exchange took less than 4 seconds. For seconds. That's not a fight. That's a lesson. Statham tried to push himself up. His right arm screamed. He rolled to his left side and got to one knee. That's when he felt Seagal's hand on his elbow. Not a punch. Not a strike. Placement. Seagal locked Statham's arm into an extension where the elbow joint was completely exposed. 1 inch of downward pressure. That's all it would take. 1 inch and Statham's arm would break in a way that no surgeon could fully repair. His career as an action star. The stunts. The fight scenes. The franchise. All of it. Gone. The crowd went dead silent. Someone inside the venue had pushed the door open. A dozen more faces appeared. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Seagal leaned down. Close enough that only Statham could hear. And he said 7 words. Calm. Quiet. Without a trace of anger. I was breaking bones before you learned how to fall, kid. Then he released Statham's arm. Stood up straight. reached down and adjusted the collar of his long black coat. And without a word, without a glance at the crowd, without looking back at the man on the ground, he walked away, down the sidewalk, into the Soho night, gone. Statham stayed on one knee for a long time. His wrist was throbbing. His elbow felt like it had been twisted in a vice. A few people from inside the event came out and asked if he was all right. He waved them off. His training partner crouched beside him, said something about getting ice. Statham shook his head. He sat back on the curb, let out a long breath, and looked down the empty street where Seagal had disappeared. Now, if you had been there that night, you might have thought the story was over. The confrontation had happened. The lesson had been delivered. Statham was embarrassed but unbroken. He could stand up, dust himself off, go home, ice his wrist, and pretend it never happened. And for about 15 minutes, that's exactly what it looked like. Statham stood up, rolled his shoulder, laughed it off with his training partner, called it a lucky grab, said the pavement was wet, said he wasn't ready. The usual things men say when their pride has been cracked in public and they need to fill the silence with something. The crowd thinned. People went back inside. The music from the event drifted through the open door. The cold London air settled. And for a brief, quiet moment, it seemed like the night would simply move on. But it didn't, because someone had filmed the whole thing. Now here's the thing about 2005. Smartphones were just starting to take hold. Camera phones were everywhere, but the footage was grainy. Low resolution, easy to dismiss, but not easy to erase. And somewhere in that small crowd on the Soho sidewalk, a young stunt coordinator named Danny Voss had pulled out his phone the moment Statham shoved Seagal. He recorded everything. The shove, the combination, the wrist catch, the takedown, the elbow lock, the whisper, the walk away, every second. 43 seconds of footage that captured, in shaky detail, the exact moment Jason Statham was humbled on a public street by a man he had called a fraud. Danny didn't post it that night. He wasn't that kind of person. He saved it, showed it to a few friends in the stunt community. Word spread quietly. Within 3 days, a handful of people in the London film industry had seen the clip on a shared email chain. Within a week, it had reached Los Angeles. And that's when Statham's phone rang. It was his publicist, a woman named Karen Holt who had been managing his image since the Transporter press tour. She was sharp, controlled, and she was furious. She told Statham that a clip was circulating. She told him it showed him getting taken down by Steven Seagal in under 5 seconds. She told him that 2 entertainment blogs had already reached out asking for comment. And she told him something that made his stomach drop. Lionsgate had seen it. Now, let me explain why that mattered. In 2005, Statham's entire career was built on one thing: credibility. He wasn't the biggest actor. He wasn't the most versatile. But he was the guy who really did it. The stunts, the fights, the training. That was his brand. That was his value. And Lionsgate had just greenlit the Transporter 3 based almost entirely on that brand. The deal wasn't signed yet. The contracts were still on desks. And now, somewhere in an email chain, there was a video of their franchise star being put on the ground by a 60-year-old man he had publicly mocked. Statham panicked. Believe me, he panicked. He called Karen back within the hour and told her to kill the video. She said she was trying. But the problem was the source. Danny Voss wasn't leaking it for money or fame. He was just showing people because he thought it was incredible. He was an Aikido student himself. To him, the clip was proof that the art worked. He wasn't trying to destroy Statham's career. He was celebrating what Seagal had done. And that made him almost impossible to control. You can negotiate with greed. You can threaten malice. But you cannot stop a man who genuinely thinks he's sharing something beautiful. That was the first development. The video. The second came 2 days later. Statham's training partner, a kickboxer named Ray Fenton, gave an interview to a small martial arts magazine. It was supposed to be a puff piece about training methods for action films. But the interviewer had heard the rumors. And Ray, who was loyal but not careful, confirmed the confrontation. He didn't give details. He didn't describe the takedown, but he said enough. He said that Statham and Seagal had an exchange outside a London event. He said Seagal surprised everyone with his speed. And then he said the one thing Statham had been praying nobody would say out loud. Jason didn't land a single shot. That quote went everywhere. The martial arts community picked it up first. Then the film blogs. Then the tabloids. Within 48 hours, the story had a life of its own. And the version that spread wasn't the careful, measured account that Statham would have wanted. The version that spread was simple and devastating. Jason Statham tried to fight Steven Seagal on a London street. He lost in 5 seconds. He didn't land a single shot. Statham went quiet. He canceled 2 interviews. He stopped returning calls from his agent. He spent 3 days in his London flat with the curtains drawn, icing his wrist and watching the story mutate online from rumor to accepted fact. And here's what made it worse. Seagal said nothing. Not a word. No interviews. No statements. No social media posts. No leaked quotes from anonymous sources. Total silence. And in the world of celebrity conflict, silence from the winner is the most devastating weapon there is, because it lets the public fill in the blanks. And the blanks they filled in were brutal. He was finished, or at least that's what it felt like. The video was spreading. His own training partner had confirmed the worst of it. The studio was asking questions. And the man who had humiliated him hadn't even bothered to acknowledge it happened. Statham had 2 choices. Let the story bury him, or do something about it. He chose the second option. And it was the wrong one. Statham's plan was simple. Find Seagal. Challenge him again. This time on his terms. Controlled environment. Witnesses he trusted. And this time he wouldn't underestimate the old man. He would train specifically for Aikido counters. He would stay out of grab range. He would use footwork and angles and treat Seagal like what he actually was. A grappler with fast hands and 40 years of joint manipulation burned into his muscle memory. Statham told himself this was about redemption. About proving the sidewalk was a fluke. But the truth? The truth was simpler and uglier. His ego couldn't accept what had happened. And instead of sitting with that discomfort and learning from it, he wanted a rematch. He got word through a contact that Seagal was still in London, staying at a quiet hotel near Kensington, training every morning at a small private dojo that rented space to visiting martial artists. No cameras, no audience, just mat space and mirrors. Statham showed up on a Tuesday morning. He arrived early, waited outside the dojo in a black car. Watched Seagal walk in carrying a leather bag. Alone. Always alone. 20 minutes later, Statham walked through the door. The dojo was small, clean, wooden floors, 1 long mirror along the far wall. Seagal was stretching near the center of the mat in a white GI. He looked up when the door opened, saw Statham, and the expression on his face was not what Statham expected. It wasn't anger. It wasn't surprise. It was disappointment. That should have been the warning. Right there. A man who looks disappointed when you show up for a fight is a man who already knows how the fight ends. Statham stepped onto the mat. He was wearing training gear, compression shirt, fight shorts, taped wrists. He had come prepared. He set his feet, raised his guard, and said, "No tricks this time. Just you and me." Seagal stood up slowly. He didn't take a stance. He just stood, hands at his sides, relaxed, open. And he said something that Statham would repeat in private for years afterward. He said, "You came all this way to learn the same lesson twice?" Statham didn't answer. He moved first. A quick step forward. Jab, cross. But this time he pulled back fast. Stayed out of range. Circled. Threw a low kick from a long angle. Reset. He was fighting smart. Keeping distance, treating Seagal like a counterfighter, which he was. But here's the thing about Aikido that most people misunderstand. It doesn't need you to come close. It needs you to commit. And every strike Statham threw, no matter how carefully he pulled back, carried commitment, energy, momentum, and Seagal could read every ounce of it. On the 5th exchange, Statham overcommit. Just slightly. A right cross that extended 1 inch past his safe zone. That was all Seagal needed. He stepped offline, caught the wrist again. But this time, instead of a sweep, he used a technique called kotegaeshi, a wrist reversal. He turned Statham's hand back on itself with a smooth, circular motion that sent a wave of agony through his forearm, elbow, and shoulder. Statham's body followed his wrist. It had no choice. He spun. His feet left the ground, and he landed flat on his back on the wooden floor with a sound that echoed off every wall in that small dojo. The wind left him. His vision blurred for a second, and when it cleared, Seagal was standing over him again. Same calm face, same steady breathing. This time he didn't lock the elbow. He didn't need to. The point had already been made. Seagal crouched down, looked Statham in the eye, and spoke quietly. No malice, no gloating, just truth. You are fast, you are strong, and you are brave, but you are fighting me like I am one of your movie villains. I am not. I have spent my life learning how a body breaks. You have spent yours learning how to make a camera believe you are dangerous. Those are not the same thing. And until you understand that difference, you will end up on this floor every single time. He stood up, offered his hand. Statham stared at it for a long moment. His wrist was on fire. His back ached from the impact. His pride was in pieces on a dojo floor in Kensington. He took the hand. Seagal pulled him to his feet. Then he did something Statham didn't expect. He bowed. A deep, formal bow. The kind a teacher gives a student who has shown courage even in defeat. Statham didn't bow back. Not yet. He wasn't ready for that. He stood there, breathing hard, gripping his wrist, looking at the man he had called a fraud for 3 years. And for the first time he saw him clearly. Not the aging action star. Not the joke at industry parties. Not the punchline. He saw the martial artist. The real one. If you've made it this far into the story, do me a favor. Hit subscribe and follow. Because what happens next between these two men is something nobody saw coming. Statham left the dojo that morning without saying a word. He walked to his car, sat behind the wheel, and didn't start the engine for 20 minutes. He just sat there. His wrist was swelling. His back was stiff. But the pain that bothered him the most wasn't physical. It was the realization that he had been wrong. Not wrong about one thing. Wrong about everything. He had spent 3 years mocking a man he didn't understand. He had dismissed an entire martial art because it didn't look the way he thought fighting was supposed to look. He had confused speed with skill, power with mastery, and he had confused what worked on camera with what worked in real life. Seagal had shown him the difference. Twice. And the second time, he had done it with more respect than Statham had ever shown him. That's a hard thing to sit with. Believe me, when you've built your whole identity on being the real deal. The man who does his own stunts. The man who trains harder than anyone else. And then someone shows you, gently and completely, that your version of real doesn't even come close to theirs. That changes something inside you. Something permanent. Statham drove back to his flat. He iced his wrist. He canceled his remaining appointments for the week. And then he did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He picked up the phone and called his publicist, Karen Holt. But not to talk about the video. Not to talk about damage control or spin or counter-narratives. He told her to set up a meeting with Seagal. Karen thought he had lost his mind. She told him that reaching out to Seagal right now, while the video was still circulating, while the press was still poking around, would look like surrender. It would confirm every rumor. It would hand Seagal the narrative on a silver plate. She begged him to wait. Let the story die. Move on. Focus on the Lionsgate deal. Statham listened. Then he said, "Set it up, Karen. I owe the man something." The meeting happened 4 days later. A private restaurant in Mayfair. Back room. No press. No cameras. No publicists. Just 2 men at a table with a pot of tea between them. Now, I want you to picture this. Jason Statham, 38 years old. Peak of his physical powers. Hollywood's most credible action star. Sitting across from Steven Seagal, 53 years old. Career in decline. Mocked by the industry. wearing the same kind of black coat he wore the night he walked away from Statham on that Soho sidewalk. And Statham apologized. He didn't make excuses. He didn't qualify it. He didn't say, "I'm sorry but," or, "I respect you however." He looked Seagal in the eye and said he was sorry. For the interviews. For the public mockery. For the shove on the sidewalk. For showing up at the dojo looking for a rematch instead of looking for understanding. He said all of it. Plainly. Simply. Like a man who had thought carefully about what he needed to say and wasn't going to waste a single word. Seagal listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod. He didn't react at all until Statham was finished. Then he poured 2 cups of tea, slid one across the table, and said something that carries more weight than anything that happened on that sidewalk or in that dojo. He said, "The strongest thing a fighter can do is admit when he has been beaten. Not on the mat. Anyone can tap. I mean here." And he pointed to his own chest. When a man can admit defeat in his heart, he stops fighting the wrong battles. And that is when he becomes dangerous for the right reasons. They talked for 2 hours. Seagal told Statham things about Aikido that no interview had ever captured. He explained the philosophy behind the redirection. That Aikido was never about hurting someone. It was about using their own energy against them so completely that they had no choice but to stop. He said the goal was never to break an opponent. It was to show them, physically and undeniably, that their aggression was their own worst enemy. Statham listened, really listened, for maybe the first time in his career. And here's what came out of that conversation. Something small but real. Statham asked Seagal if he would be willing to teach him. Not formally, not publicly, just a few sessions. Enough to understand the principles he had been dismissing for years. Seagal agreed. One condition. No cameras. No publicity. And Statham could never use what he learned to mock Aikido again. Not in interviews. Not on set. Not in private. Statham accepted. Over the next 3 weeks, Statham visited that small Kensington dojo 6 times. He trained with Seagal in private sessions that lasted 2 hours each. He learned yukami, the art of falling. He learned how to redirect force instead of meeting it head-on. He learned wrist locks, joint manipulations, and throws that he had never encountered in any kickboxing gym or MMA facility. And he learned something that no amount of weight training or sparring had ever taught him. He learned patience. Because Aikido doesn't reward aggression. Punishes it. Every instinct Statham had built over years of combat training was the exact instinct that put him on the ground. He wasn't good at it. Let me be honest about that. Aikido takes years to internalize. Decades. And Statham's body was trained to do the opposite of everything Aikido asked. Strike instead of redirect. Power through instead of flow around. Resist instead of yield. During one session, Seagal threw him 11 times in 20 minutes. 11 times. And each time Statham got up slower. Not because he was hurt, because he was beginning to understand how much he didn't know. That kind of understanding doesn't come from books or conversations. It comes from your back hitting the mat so many times that your body finally starts asking your ego to sit down and be quiet. But he showed up. Every session. On time. Respectful. Quiet. And he took every fall without complaint. On the last session, as they were packing up, Statham did something he hadn't done in the dojo that first morning. He bowed. A deep, formal bow. The kind a student gives a teacher. Seagal returned it. And for a moment, in that small room with the wooden floors and the long mirror, 2 men who the world thought were enemies stood in mutual respect. No cameras. No crowd. No press. Just 2 fighters who had found something neither of them expected. Not friendship exactly. Something rarer than that. Mutual recognition. The kind of respect that can only exist between 2 people who have tested each other and come out the other side honest. Now, the video did eventually die down. Karen Holt managed the press cycle. The Lionsgate deal went through. Statham went on to make The Transporter 3, The Expendables, and a dozen more action films. His career didn't just survive. It grew. But something about him changed after that autumn in London. People close to him noticed it. His stunt coordinators noticed it. Even the way he moved on set was different. Less rigid. Less forced. There was a looseness in his technique that hadn't been there before. A willingness to flow instead of fight every motion. He stopped mocking other martial artists in interviews. Completely. If you go back and watch his press appearances from 2006 onward, you will notice it. The arrogance is gone. The dismissiveness is gone. When interviewers asked him about other action stars, he deflected. Changed the subject. Or simply said, "Everyone in this business has earned their place." And Seagal? He continued on his own path. More films. More training. More silence. He never spoke publicly about what happened on that Soho sidewalk. Never mentioned the dojo sessions. Never leaked a single detail to the press. The man who had been mocked as a relic kept his dignity by keeping his mouth shut and letting his hands speak only when absolutely necessary. There's a lesson in this story. And it's not about who is the better fighter. It's not about Aikido versus kickboxing or youth versus experience. The lesson is simpler than that. And harder. It's about the moment you realize that the person you've been laughing at knows something you don't. And what you do with that realization defines you more than any punch you'll ever throw. Statham could have stayed on the ground. He could have let his pride turn to bitterness. He could have spent years trying to discredit Seagal to protect his own image. A lot of men would have. But he didn't. He stood up. He reached out. He learned. And that took more strength than anything he ever did on a movie set. Remember that opening line? Some men carry their pride like a weapon, never knowing it can be turned against them. That was Jason Statham in the autumn of 2005, walking out onto a London sidewalk with his pride raised like a fist. But by the time that autumn was over, he had learned to put it down. And that, believe me, that is the hardest fight any man will ever win.